Ed here with a Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick update on my experience with the Sony CyberShot RX10 IV. For those of you unfamiliar with this beast of a bridge camera, it just recently launched last week, priced at $1,700 US, really a hair under, and so far I am very impressed with the product. Now, I have reviewed every version of the RX10 line, starting with 1 all the way up to the Mark IV. And I will be posting a comparison of this camera to the previous generation, the Mark III, which in terms of physical attributes looks identical to this. However, it does not have the autofocus speed or overall prowess that the brand new Mark IV entails. So, for those of you unfamiliar with this, we've got a 20 megapixel sensor, stacked design or engineering rather, high frame rate, in other words up to 960 frames per second on the video side, 4K UHD video capture with this, a 24 to 600 millimeter Carl Zeiss piece of glass fixed to this, which like the Mark III generation is a stellar piece of glass for a bridge camera. And then now we actually have performance to back it up, because even though the Mark III was great, certainly the most expensive bridge camera of its time, we now have a bridge camera that has some chops when it comes to autofocus. And that's because this great lens and phenomenal 20 megapixel sensor, 20.1, now has a hybrid phase and contrast autofocus system, up to exactly 315 points of phase detection on this sensor. So that means when you go out shooting with this camera, you aren't going to be left high and dry when it comes to autofocus prowess. Now, in terms of battery life, we are still working with the W battery, so you're not going to have the newfound battery life found with Sony's full frame A9, but I can tell you that overall performance mixed use has been fairly good. Keep in mind that for those of you wondering what the purpose of this camera is, like the RX10 Mark III before it, it's really aimed at two types of users. The first would be the person who wants one camera that can do it all, and that's exactly what the RX10 Mark IV delivers on. Now, I could have said that about the RX10 Mark III, but without the autofocus capability that the Mark IV packs, it's less easy to give the Mark III that compliment. And that's part of the reason Sony jacked up the price here on the brand new Mark IV. In terms of other niceties that this camera has to offer, of course we have a hot shoe, a flash, we have a readout on the top to give you basic information when the camera is on in terms of battery life, number of shots remaining on your SD card, all of that stuff. The button configuration layout is essentially the same. Nothing really changed from Mark III to Mark IV. Again, it's all about that autofocus system, because we've got up to 24 shots per second now, which is a 10-shot jump, 14 on the RX10 Mark III, now 24 in burst mode. So if you go into drive mode, you will get 24 shots, and it's kind of mind-numbing. It reminds me of the Sony A9. Granted, we're working with a 1-inch sensor, not even an APS-C or full frame, but still incredible how quickly this thing rolls off those 24 shots. Shutter button, zoom, your on and off switch, customizable buttons, your mode dial on the far left, microphone array, hot shoe, EVF with eye sensor, menu, movie button, another programmable dial here. Basically all of the same layout, in terms of buttons that I've mentioned in the past. We also have touch to focus now on here. Not a touchscreen, so this is not a full-blown touchscreen. Don't get too excited. The screen does pull out, but this is not a fully articulating display. Maybe one day Sony will allow us to swing that thing around for vlogging purposes, things of that nature. Otherwise, you'll have to rely on an external display, just as you would have with any other RX10 from days past. On the left-hand side, microphone, headphone, input, well, all of the I/O ports, HDMI and multi-port. The camera is weather sealed, but As I've mentioned in basically any video where I cover a Sony camera, I don't recommend testing that. The idea is that you've got a form of protection, but you certainly are far from bulletproof. Wi-Fi, NFC, just like the generation before it. Your focus control right here, infinity, as well as a focus lock button. On the bottom of that lens right here, we have the ability to turn the click on and off for the aperture ring that is located right here. This all began with the original RX1, and it's just a great thing to see it trickle down all these years later, because it was a really smart thing that Sony did, and well, here it still lives on. Now, in terms of performance, what I can tell you is that much more keepers than the RX10 Mark III. And that in itself already tells you, and that's just with shooting in auto, not getting technical, not learning, every nuance of the camera yet, that I have not realized the full potential of this photographic tool. And I'm already really impressed. Onboard audio is very good, but it has been in every generation, and at $1,700, it still should be. You've got video profiles, the high frame rate shooting, so if you just turn this dial to HFR, you can go all the way up to 960 frames per second. I recommend sticking with 240. That's where you're going to really get the best image quality and effect. Essentially, it'll give you an 18-second clip. I've posted one really great clip, at least from my first go-around with shooting in HFR mode. It's mildly cumbersome, but if you get it right, the results are really outstanding. I mean, the one shot I got, I found to be gorgeous. Of course, I got a lot of others that were a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, the fact that on day one of shooting with this, I was able to get one clip that I was really happy with, and several others that were still good, but not necessarily something I would show off, says a lot about the ability of this camera to perform with a very small learning curve. And that's the great thing about the RX10 lineup, or all RX series cameras, but the Mark IV here really embodies it, is that you can be a novice and just run out there and throw this thing into auto and shoot to your heart's content, and you'll get images that people will ask you, have you been studying? Have you been learning? What have you been doing? But the reality is that this camera, like much of the RX lineup, takes the guesswork and a lot of the learning curve out of the equation for you. Now, I'm not saying that's generally a great thing for the hobby, but for making more intelligent and useful cameras for the masses, this accomplishes exactly that. And whether you think it's right or wrong, it is inherently important for Sony and other manufacturers to do exactly that, because every day that goes by, another moron thinks a smartphone can replace a camera. Now, I'm not calling everyone that uses a smartphone as a camera a moron, but people that use it instead of even considering purchasing a camera, yeah, you're a little bit of a moron. And I'm not trying to be insulting, but the reality is that if you think that your smartphone can outclass, like I even had a comment, this person will get all excited that I'm basically calling them out, but they're a prime example. I had put up a video sample from this camera, 600 millimeter, shot of some vultures, and then I pulled out wide, and the idiot commented and wrote that they could have accomplished that with their Note 8. Now, those of you that follow my channel know I have the Note 8. I love it. Best phone on the market, and it's going to be for quite some time. But in what world someone could believe that they could achieve a 600 millimeter reach and still retain detail? I mean, it just shows that they have absolutely zero knowledge, not just in a photographic sense, but of anything, likely, because, the Note 8 has a 2x optical zoom. Forget about sensor size. I'm not even going to get into that. It's just farcical, to say the least. So the RX10 Mark IV really does change the game, in my opinion. I mean, having the 315 points of phase detection on that autofocus, it really delivers what I had hoped the RX10 Mark III would be. You know, the Mark III, I was really happy, brought a telephoto lens to a fantastic sensor, which Panasonic had teased us with their FZ line, but had never taken it up a notch. Sony did that, matched it, and then they said, hey, we're putting everything on the RX10 Mark IV, all bets on the table. And that's exactly what they did by giving us faster and more accurate autofocus. And that's where the RX10 Mark IV does start to cannibalize some of the interchangeable lens cameras out there, including Sony's very own. And I'll get into that in comparisons. I'll likely compare this camera to the A6500, not so much the A6300, just because it's not close in price. But the A6500 and even the A7R Mark II, since I do have both of those to reference as an active, experienced user with all of those cameras. Another side note, I think the RX100 Mark V and this camera together on a vacation, you probably don't need anything else. Now, if you're a professional photographer or such an enthusiastic hobbyist that you need prime lenses, yeah, of course it's not going to do the trick. But I think they do represent a synergy of flexibility that you could never find with two cameras and travel that lightly and yet have so much capability. And granted, a lot of that is to do with the fact that both of them do have phase detection on their sensors, even though they don't have the largest sensors with the most dynamic range and all of the flexibility that you get out of an interchangeable mirrorless system. The fact that when I shoot 24 frames on this, it reminds me of the A9 is just an incredible compliment to be paying to a bridge camera, let alone even with its enormous $1,700 price tag, still nowhere near what you're going to shell out on something like the A9 and then lenses to complement it. So I really do, I will say without hesitation, love this camera. I will be selling my RX10 Mark III, no question about it. And that's because, again, it is a game changer when it comes to the bridge style of camera. Does it mean every shot is a keeper? Absolutely not. 315 points of phase detection isn't going to accomplish that. In fact, all of the phase detection points of the A9 aren't going to accomplish that. But put them side by side, and the price difference is a joke. I mean, if you are willing to consider the Mark III over the Mark IV, then you just don't care about the autofocus system. And if you can do everything manually, kudos to you. I appreciate that and understand where you're coming from. But for the majority of users out there, they want that autofocus prowess. And the fact that it can do, 10 more frames per second on the still side is just a bonus. So thus far, when it comes to still and video, tracking of your subject, just the accuracy of the autofocus, top notch, the best I've ever seen from any bridge camera on the market, and it certainly bests a lot of interchangeable lens cameras from some other manufacturers that I will not name today. And as I mentioned earlier, it does cannibalize some of Sony's own models. I'm not going to say that it outperforms the A6500 when paired with appropriate glass, because keep in mind the A6500 has a huge advantage over this, which is that it does have 5-axis image stabilization. And that's what, if I had to say there's one thing I wish this camera had at $1,700, I wish it had that 5-axis image stabilization, because all that would mean is that handheld shooting with this wouldn't look like handheld shooting, and it still does. That is probably my biggest issue or complaint, which really isn't a complaint, because how perfect a camera is Sony going to make even at $1,700? They know, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to cannibalize some of the market. They don't want to see it eradicate the rest of their DI business. So they have to pick and choose how much they're going to really bring to any model, whether we're talking about CyberShot fixed lens cameras like this, or even in the interchangeable world. I mean, look at how the A9 does not have, at launch, no video profiles. Here we've got video profiles. We even have video profiles with the RX100 Mark V, $1,000 point-and-shoot pocket camera, even though you have to have a slightly large pocket. So It's give and take, no question about it. 1700, a lot of cash. Could you put it towards an interchangeable lens system? Of course you could, but that's not who Sony is targeting. The two users are really the people that want the all-in-one that can do everything, which this definitely qualifies as, and then interchangeable lens camera users that are tired of carrying around a gear bag, but no manufacturer has been able to present them with a product that could truly replace all of that gear. This is the camera that does that, folks. Everything else before it was an attempt. This is an execution. That sounds wrong, but hopefully you understand what I'm saying. And that's because between its autofocus speed and accuracy, and then already fantastic stacked CMOS sensor, combined with an amazing piece of Carl Zeiss glass, you get results both in the still and video world that you simply could never get with a single piece of equipment. And then the fact that it does have, all of the input, the I/O ports that you would need to even be semi-pro. You want to have video monitoring. I mean, you could get a gimbal for this and obviously bring that 5-axis stabilization that it's missing. There are ways to really turn this into an even more comprehensive beast than Sony has already presented. And that's where I think things are going to get really interesting. The 4K video out of this has been basically the same as what I got out of the Mark III, but again, the tracking in the autofocus system is the difference. And both in still and video, that is critical. In terms of just, giving you a quick look at, what startup time is like, I can tell you just as quick as the RX10 Mark III. And then as I place it down, you're going to probably get a little reflection of me here. Going to bring out the screen. My OLED in front of it is going to have me slightly in the frame. You can see right there. Just a quick rundown of the menu system as best as I can give you that. And I'll get into this in my full review eventually, but I mean, if you've made it this far, hopefully you haven't, you're still here. So just a quick look at this. Again, there are just so many settings, customizations. I mean, anyone who thinks that this is a traditional point and shoot camera is on another planet, smoking something, you fill in the blank, whatever it may be. Because this really does give you, you can see I started playing with the clear image zoom just to see how degraded things get. And I have news for you, they don't really. And that's because cropping on this sensor isn't an issue, just like the Mark III before it. But again, now we're complemented by the fact that we have a real autofocus system, not that contrast-based crap that Sony was always criticized for. So this is Sony, once again, responding to users, listening to complaints or desires, I should say. Let's not structure everything as negative, and bringing it to the table in a physical product. And that's exactly, what I have experienced so far with this camera. You see the touch operation right there, touch panel only, pad only. They give you the options. So you have that ability to basically decide how you want that to operate. But just so much for the 1700 that anyone who thinks this camera is overpriced, I don't know what they were thinking they were going to get of similar quality and capability for the budget. Now, I don't have an SD card in here. That's why you can see the top screen is only showing us battery life. If I did, we'd be getting more of a readout. If I go ahead and hit the shutter button, you can see already, you've got your aperture, and essentially it's telling you what mode you're in, all the applicable stuff. There I am. Hey, what's up? You see me for a moment there. The man behind the camera. Well, I'm also in it. It's just hands, baby, hands. But again, this camera, really tough to beat when you take into account everything. You can see the touch indicator coming up right there, which you can turn on and off just by touching it. And that was a nice thing for Sony to implement. Of course, you can control the zoom speed. Right now, I'm at the normal level. I have not really noticed in any of my videos the zoom being captured by onboard audio, so that's definitely a good thing. If I went to the slow mode, I know it would not capture it at all. And it still is sensitive on the trigger, so if you go full blast, it's definitely going to still move more quickly than if you're gradual with the zoom rocker, even though we are at the normal speed. You can see it kick into high gear as I play with it. So sensitivity, very good. The fact that it's not picking up audio, another good thing. Haven't played a lot with the Wi-Fi, so I can't speak to the Play Memories app store and all of those things. I would generally say those are, nice add-ons, but to a lot of users, those elements are simply gimmicks, and I understand why. Time-lapse, things like that, I absolutely think are a must for a camera of this caliber and versatility. But overall, right now, I can tell you the RX10 Mark IV is a winner. If you're in the market for a bridge-style camera, this will not be beat by the competition. There's simply nothing like it, nothing on the horizon that's going to best it. And that's what Sony tends to do very well. They make cameras that no one else is making. They are rolling the dice while the rest of the company may be suffering. The DI department continues to just knock them out of the park. And that doesn't mean every product is perfect. I'll discuss that in my comparison with the Mark III, because the Mark IV really makes the Mark III look like it's many generations older rather than its most recent predecessor. And that's, again, only because Sony decided to take the autofocus system and redefine it. And that's what makes the Mark IV worth the money. That's what it comes down to. I wouldn't be recommending it if it didn't have that new autofocus system, because what good is all this gear, all this reach, the great sensor, if you don't have the autofocus to match? And that's exactly what they brought to the table here. Battery life, you're looking, it's fairly average. It's a lot like the Mark III, so no real improvement there. With mixed use, if you start using the HFR and filming UHD video and stills, you're going to see that battery, drop fairly quickly. I think I spent like an hour shooting and I was down to, about 50% fairly quickly. And that was with mixed use. So I think Sony's advertised number of around 400 to 500 shots, if you're in still mode only, is probably accurate, but I would lean towards the lower number. But overall, the camera's great, whether you're shooting in auto or leveraging everything you've ever learned about photography. Of course, there your results are going to only excel further. But the beauty of this camera is that a novice can pick it up, shoot, and come out with results that don't look like, a novice was actually involved in its use. And that's the beauty of the entire RX lineup. But here with the Mark IV, the RX10 Mark IV, you really have a jack of all trades and a master of all of those, in a sense. At the long end, do things get soft? Sure, any telephoto lens does, even my G Master 100 to 400, although it stays pretty sharp. But the RX10 Mark IV, again, worth every dollar, in my opinion, in my use so far. And for those of you wondering why I called this a quick update, well, if you're a subscriber, you know my quick updates are usually long updates. At any rate, hope you enjoyed the video. Again, the RX10 Mark IV at a little under $1,700 US. If you can get your hands on it right now, I do not think you will be disappointed. Nothing but a warm welcome to this camera online and by reviewers, myself included, and that's because it really does live up to the hype. The new autofocus system is a game changer. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button. And as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.